Battle of Stalingrad stands as one of the most pivotal and harrowing confrontations of World War II. Spanning from August 23, 1942 to February 2, 1943. This battle wasn't merely a clash of military forces, it was a struggle of ideologies, a test of endurance, and a battle of wills. The outcome of this brutal fight would not only determine the fate of Stalingrad, but also shape the future of the entire world. The frozen streets of this industrial city witnessed some of the most intense and ferocious fighting ever recorded, with both the Axis and Soviet forces pouring everything they had into the fight. This is the story of how the Battle of Stalingrad turned the tide of the war and became a symbol of the indomitable human spirit. The strategic importance of Stalingrad. In the early months of 1942, Adolf Hitler's gaze was fixed on the Soviet Union, where the Eastern Front had become the primary theater of war. The Nazi war machine, having swept across Europe, now sought to break the Soviet Union by capturing its industrial and resource-rich regions. The city of Stalingrad, located on the western bank of the Volga River, was a prime target. Not only was it a vital industrial hub producing tanks, aircraft, and artillery, but it also held symbolic importance as it bore the name of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. Capturing Stalingrad would not only cripple Soviet production capabilities, but would also deliver a psychological blow to Soviet morale. Moreover, Stalingrad was a key to controlling the Caucasus region's oil fields, which were crucial for fueling the Nazi war effort. If the Germans could secure Stalingrad and push southward, they would gain access to the vast oil reserves that were essential for sustaining their military operations. Thus, the battle for Stalingrad was not just a fight for a city. It was a fight for control of the resources that would determine the war's outcome. The German offensive begins. On August 23, 1942, the German 6th Army, under the command of General Friedrich Paulus, launched its assault on Stalingrad. The offensive began with a massive aerial bombardment by the Luftwaffe, which reduced much of the city to rubble. The German advance was swift and brutal, as tanks and infantry pushed Soviet forces back towards the Volga River. The Luftwaffe's dominance in the skies allowed the Germans to bomb and strafe Soviet positions with relative impunity, further weakening the already beleaguered defenders. As the Germans advanced, they expected the city to fall quickly, just as so many others had before it. The initial German success seemed to confirm this belief, as they captured large portions of the city's outskirts and began pushing into the industrial districts. However, the Soviets, under the command of General Vasily Chuikov, were far from defeated. Chuikov, known for his tenacity, ordered his troops to hold their ground at all costs. He understood that the battle would not be won in open fields, but in the ruins of the city, where every street, building, and room could become a defensive stronghold. Urban warfare. A city turned battlefield. The battle soon descended into a nightmare of urban warfare, unlike anything the German soldiers had experienced. The city of Stalingrad, with its maze of factories, apartment blocks, and narrow streets, was transformed into a deadly battleground. The Soviets turned every building into a fortress, every street into a killing zone. The Germans, trained for rapid, mobile warfare, found themselves bogged down in a grinding, attritional battle, where progress was measured in meters, not miles. Soviet snipers, hidden among the ruins, picked off German officers and soldiers with deadly precision. Soviet troops launched ambushes from sewers and basements, striking with brutal efficiency before melting back into the city's labyrinthine ruins. Chuikov's strategy of hugging the enemy, keeping his forces as close to the Germans as possible, was particularly effective in neutralizing the Luftwaffe's air superiority. The Germans could not use their overwhelming air power to its full potential without risking their own troops. The fighting in Stalingrad was savage and relentless. soldiers on both sides endured unimaginable conditions, with the constant threat of death hanging over them. Food, water, and medical supplies were scarce. The Volga River, which served as a lifeline for the Soviet defenders, was constantly under German artillery fire, making resupply missions perilous. Despite this, the Soviets continued to ferry reinforcements and supplies across the river, ensuring that the defenders of Stalingrad could continue their resistance. The strain of winter. As the brutal fighting continued into the autumn, the onset of the Russian winter added a new layer of hardship. The already devastated city was now blanketed in snow, and temperatures plummeted to bone-chilling lows. For the German soldiers, many of whom were ill-prepared for the severe cold, the winter was a merciless enemy. Frostbite, starvation, and disease began to take a heavy toll, weakening their fighting capability. Supplies were running dangerously low, and the once unstoppable German advance was grinding to a halt. Meanwhile, the Soviets were better equipped to handle the winter conditions. The Soviet High Command, under the leadership of Marshal Georgy Zhukov, began to plan a counteroffensive that would exploit the German vulnerabilities. The Soviet forces were not only fighting for their city, but for their survival. The knowledge that retreat was not an option, combined with the bitter cold, hardened their resolve. Operation Uranus, the Soviet counteroffensive. On November 19, 1942, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus, a massive counteroffensive designed to encircle the German Sixth Army and its allies. The operation was meticulously planned and executed with devastating precision. The Soviets struck from the north and south, targeting the weaker Romanian and Hungarian forces that were guarding the German flanks. These forces, poorly equipped and demoralized, crumbled under the weight of the Soviet assault, allowing the Red Army to advance rapidly. Within days, the Soviets had encircled the German Sixth Army, trapping it inside Stalingrad. General Paulus and his men were now cut off from the rest of the German forces, surrounded by a relentless and determined enemy. Hitler, obsessed with holding Stalingrad at all costs, forbade Paulus from attempting a breakout. The German High Command promised a relief effort, but it never materialized. The Luftwaffe attempted to airlift supplies to the encircled troops, but these efforts were woefully inadequate. The German soldiers trapped in Stalingrad were left to face the harsh winter with dwindling food, ammunition, and medical supplies. The Siege and Desperation. The encirclement of the German Sixth Army marked the beginning of a desperate and horrific siege. The conditions inside the pocket were appalling. Soldiers huddled in the freezing cold, their bodies ravaged by hunger and disease. The daily rations, when they arrived, were barely enough to sustain life. The once proud Sixth Army, which had marched into Stalingrad with confidence, was now a shadow of its former self, reduced to a starving, demoralized mass of men. The Soviets, meanwhile, tightened their grip on the encircled Germans. Artillery bombardments were relentless, and Soviet infantry launched frequent attacks to wear down the already exhausted German defenders. The German soldiers, many of them suffering from frostbite and malnutrition, fought on with grim determination, but it was clear that the situation was hopeless. As the weeks dragged on, the situation became increasingly desperate. German soldiers began to surrender in small groups, realizing that their chances of survival were better as prisoners of war than as defenders of a doomed position. General Paulus, facing the reality that his army was on the verge of annihilation, requested permission to surrender. Hitler, however, insisted that Stalingrad be held to the last man, refusing to acknowledge the dire situation. The fall of Stalingrad. By January 1943, the German Sixth Army was at the breaking point. The men were starving, exhausted, and out of ammunition. On January 31, 1943, General Paulus, now promoted to Field Marshal in a last-ditch effort by Hitler to inspire him to fight to the death, surrendered. It was the first time in history that a German Field Marshal had surrendered to the enemy. Over 90,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner, many of whom would never return home, succumbing to the harsh conditions of Soviet captivity. The fall of Stalingrad was a catastrophic defeat for Nazi Germany. It marked the first significant defeat of the German army in the war and shattered the myth of their invincibility. The loss of an entire army, along with the destruction of Germany's strategic position on the Eastern Front, was a turning point in World War II. From this point on, the initiative would shift to the Soviets, who would begin their relentless advance towards Berlin. The aftermath and legacy of Stalingrad. The Battle of Stalingrad was more than just a military victory for the Soviet Union. It was a symbol of the resilience and determination of the Soviet people. The city that bore the brunt of one of the most ferocious battles in history had held firm, and in doing so, had changed the course of the war. The victory at Stalingrad boosted Soviet morale and proved that the Red Army was capable of defeating the seemingly unstoppable Wehrmacht. For Germany, the defeat was a devastating blow. The loss of the Sixth Army, combined with the failure to secure the oil fields of the Caucasus, severely weakened the German war effort. The Eastern Front, once a scene of rapid German advances, would now become a long and bloody retreat. The psychological impact of the defeat was also profound. The myth of Nazi invincibility was shattered, and the war, which had once seemed winnable, now appeared to be a lost cause. Stalingrad also had a lasting impact on military strategy. The battle demonstrated the importance of urban warfare and the difficulties of fighting in a city environment. It showed that a determined and well-prepared defender could hold out against a numerically superior and better-equipped force. The lessons learned at Stalingrad would influence military tactics and strategies for decades to come. Closing reflections. The Battle of Stalingrad remains one of the most significant and brutal battles in the history of warfare. It was a turning point in World War II, where the tide of the war shifted in favor of the Allies. The courage, sacrifice, and determination of those who fought at Stalingrad will never be forgotten. The battle serves as a reminder of the horrors of war, but also of the strength of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity. As we remember the Battle of Stalingrad, we honor the memory of those who fought and died in one of the most pivotal moments in history. And we reflect on the lessons it teaches us about the cost of war and the value of peace.